A catastrophic Russian blunder that unfolded not over weeks, not over months, but in just 72 hours. 72 hours that exposed Moscow's strategic vulnerabilities. 72 hours that sent NATO scrambling to emergency sessions. 72 hours that gave Kyiv an opening it has been waiting for since the earliest days of this war. What Russia did this week crossed a line that Western defense planners had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with speed, precision, and overwhelming force. NATO, watching from the sidelines, did not sit idle either. Within hours, alliance members triggered emergency consultations, repositioned assets across Eastern Europe, and issued one of the most direct warnings to Moscow we have seen in over a year. This is the story of how Russia's own miscalculation may have just changed the trajectory of this conflict. For several weeks now, there had been signals, not official announcements, not formal declarations, just signals, that Moscow was preparing something unusual. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a choreography. Western analysts could anticipate the escalation cycles. They could map the propaganda surges. They could track the timing of major offensives based on political calendars in Moscow. But what set off alarm bells in Brussels and Washington this month was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence officials who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators, the sudden movement of strategic reserves, the repositioning of air defense assets, the encrypted communications surges between command nodes, the sudden disappearance of senior commanders from their usual posts. All of that went quiet. And whenever Moscow goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Western intelligence agencies began increasing their surveillance. Satellite reconnaissance was redirected. Human intelligence assets were activated across multiple theaters. Everyone was watching, everyone was waiting. And then earlier this week, Russia made its move. Early Tuesday morning, NATO's Intelligence Fusion Center detected what they described as a significant and unexpected redeployment of Russian forces, including the movement of 2 full brigade tactical groups that had not been repositioned in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Moscow only moves when they are signaling something very specific, a major offensive push, a strategic withdrawal, or preparation for a significant escalation. NATO analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Russia was changing its entire operational posture along the Eastern Front, and when a nuclear-armed power shifts posture without explanation, even by the slightest margin, the entire Western alliance pays attention. What emerged over the following 48 hours was nothing short of stunning. Russia, in what appears to have been an attempt to consolidate forces for a renewed offensive, created massive gaps in their defensive lines. They pulled units from entrenched positions. They relocated logistics hubs without adequate protection. They exposed command and control nodes that had been carefully concealed for months. In military terms, this was a catastrophic operational security failure, and Ukraine saw everything. The warning issued by NATO's Supreme Allied Commander tonight was not normal. It was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Official after official, briefing after briefing, described Russia's repositioning as reckless destabilizing and perhaps most importantly, indicative of internal command dysfunction. NATO's assessment suggested that this wasn't a calculated strategic gamble. This was a blunder born from desperation, miscommunication, or both. But blunders only create opportunities if someone is ready to exploit them. Ukraine was ready. In fact, their response over the past 72 hours was among the most aggressive and coordinated we've seen since the liberation of Kherson. Here's what we know within hours of detecting Russia's repositioning. Ukrainian forces launched precision strikes on newly exposed logistics depots. These weren't the harassment strikes we've seen in previous months. These were systematic, intelligence-driven operations, the kind of strikes that Ukraine only launches when they have real-time targeting data and high confidence in their intelligence. Tonight, Ukrainian military command confirmed that their forces launched over 40 coordinated strikes on high-value Russian targets, including a forward command post that had recently been relocated for what analysts believe was preparation for a spring offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could complete their repositioning. They hit ammunition depots, they hit fuel storage facilities, they hit electronic warfare systems that were likely preparing to jam Ukrainian drone operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's planned offensive, the infrastructure that would have made it operational. This is what made NATO's warning so urgent. Russia's repositioning wasn't just poorly executed. It was actionable. It represented the kind of vulnerability that could shift momentum in the war if exploited correctly. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't waste munitions on symbolic targets. They didn't strike population centers or civilian infrastructure. They hit command nodes. They hit logistics chains. They hit the precise points that would cause maximum disruption to Russia's operational plans. Western officials speaking to media outlets tonight described Ukraine's response as textbook exploitation of enemy miscalculation. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. NATO intelligence officials now believe that Russia's repositioning was designed to test the cohesion of the Western alliance after months of political uncertainty in Washington and growing fatigue in some European capitals. Moscow wanted to see whether the West would flinch, whether NATO would delay, whether Ukraine would hesitate, but instead the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't hesitate. They launched a counter-offensive response that was so rapid, so precisely targeted, that even Russian military bloggers acknowledged the damage. You don't get Moscow's attention easily, but this week, Kyiv did. Defense analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's repositioning as a probing maneuver, a way to gauge Western resolve and Ukrainian capability before committing to a larger operation. But Ukraine proved this week that they remain both capable and willing. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian forces had no opportunity to establish defensive positions or relocate critical assets. That timing matters because it shows real-time intelligence fusion. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian movements. They are anticipating them. They are inside Russia's decision cycle. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian Air Force units carried out long-range drone strikes on at least 4 major logistics hubs, forcing Russian supply convoys to reroute through exposed secondary roads. Ukrainian artillery targeted bridge crossings that had been reinforced in the last 48 hours. Ukrainian special operations forces operating deep behind Russian lines reportedly disabled communication relays used by Russian commanders to coordinate troop movements. This wasn't just a tactical response. This wasn't just a defensive reaction. This was operational initiative. This was momentum. And momentum is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed Kyiv offensive in the first weeks of the war. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that denies them consolidation. Every time Russia tries to establish a new normal, Ukraine disrupts it. And this week, that pattern continued with devastating effect. Remember, Russia thought this repositioning would go unnoticed. They thought Western attention was divided. They thought Ukraine was too depleted from the winter months to respond aggressively. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Western intelligence detected the movement almost immediately. NATO's response was coordinated within hours. And Ukraine launched one of its most effective strike campaigns of the entire war. Moscow miscalculated. And that miscalculation has now exposed vulnerabilities that Russia cannot easily repair. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Russia's blunder happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under immense domestic and international pressure. Hardliners in Moscow want more aggressive action. Military leaders want more resources. Economic advisors want the conflict to wind down before sanctions cause irreversible damage. And political allies want something they can call a victory. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a war that has now lasted far longer than anyone in his inner circle predicted. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Russia's repositioning wasn't a sign of confidence. It was a sign of desperation. And desperate moves create mistakes. This week, we saw exactly how costly those mistakes can be. NATO's formal statement, now circulated to all member states, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow Russia's miscalculation to escalate into something larger. Officials said plainly that Russia's sudden troop movements were inconsistent with any stated defensive posture. That is diplomatic language for, we know exactly what you're doing and we're ready to respond. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. The statement also reaffirmed the alliance's commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, confirmed that additional reconnaissance assets have been deployed to the region, and it warned that any escalation by Russia would be met with appropriate and proportional measures. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation in a direct, resolute speech tonight. He said, "Russia believed they could move in the shadows. They were wrong." He said, "Our forces have shown that we see everything, we know everything, and we will strike everything that threatens our people." And he said, "This week, Ukraine did not just defend. We disrupted, we degraded, and we demonstrated that the momentum of this war is shifting." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky's tone tonight was not defensive. It was confident. It was the tone of a commander who knows his forces just delivered a significant blow. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's repositioning wasn't isolated. Along with the troop movements in the east, Russian naval forces in the Black Sea also increased their patrol activity near Ukrainian coastal approaches. Russian cyber units launched a coordinated attack on Ukrainian power infrastructure. Russian state media dramatically increased its rhetoric about Western aggression and NATO provocations. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Moscow moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway, whether that's preparation for an offensive, preparation for a propaganda campaign, or preparation for some form of escalation remains unclear. But what is clear is that Russia is not backing down. They are doubling down. And that makes the coming weeks extremely volatile. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a renewed spring offensive, using this repositioning as a way to consolidate forces before a major push. Another is that Russia is attempting to draw Ukrainian forces into exposed positions, creating a trap that would allow for a devastating counterattack. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is preparing for an escalation that goes beyond conventional military operations. But this week, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait to see what Russia would do. They didn't hesitate while intelligence was being analyzed. They didn't give Russia time to consolidate. They struck. And in doing so, they disrupted whatever Moscow was planning before it could materialize. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine's Western backers will maintain their support through another year of conflict. Ukraine wants to show that it remains capable of offensive action, not just defensive survival. NATO wants to prevent this miscalculation from spiraling into a wider European conflict, and the United States wants to prevent any scenario that forces direct military involvement. All of these objectives are in tension. All of them depend on what happens in the coming days. Tonight, we've heard from NATO commanders who are now monitoring Russian positions in real time. They say Russia is attempting to re-establish defensive lines in the areas exposed by the repositioning. They say logistics convoys are being rerouted, causing significant delays in resupply operations. And they say Russia's decision to move so many assets simultaneously is likely part of a broader strategy intended to overwhelm Western monitoring capabilities, a strategy that clearly failed. But Ukraine is not resting. In fact, Ukraine is pressing the advantage. Their response this week, swift, coordinated, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that miscalculations will be punished, and it sent a message to NATO that Ukraine remains a capable and determined partner. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with this repositioning. But what we do know is that NATO's rapid response was timely. It reassured Eastern European allies who had been increasingly anxious about Russian intentions. It demonstrated that the alliance's intelligence-sharing mechanisms are functioning effectively, and it signaled to Moscow that the West is watching every move. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 72 hours. If they pull back and attempt to consolidate, this moment will be remembered as a significant setback for Moscow's war effort. If they double down and escalate, NATO and Ukraine have already shown they are prepared for that contingency. They have shown they're ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, Russia appears to be on the back foot. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Moscow is quiet, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because this week, Russia learned something they should have learned long ago. Ukraine does not wait. Ukraine does not hesitate. And Ukraine does not miss when opportunity presents itself. This story is far from over, but tonight, one thing is clear: Russia's blunder was real. Ukraine's response was devastating, and NATO is more united than it has been in months. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.